Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk about what we're going to do in this week. We're going to study chapter 12. Chapter 12 is about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate means total, so it's kind of related to chapter 3. So if you do not remember demand supply, or you still kind of struggle with the concepts of demand supply, quantity demand and quantity supply, I definitely recommend you guys, before you start taking a look at even this chapter 12, go back to chapter 3, review chapter 3 quickly, make sure you understand law of demand, law of supply, determinants of demand, determinants of supply, and then come back and study chapter 12. Okay, so in chapter 3 we basically talked about demand and supply in one specific market, perfect competition market, right? But in chapter 12 we're going to talk about demand and supply for the entire economy. That's a big difference between chapter 3 and chapter 12. So chapter 3 was about just the market. We talked about market demand and market supply. In chapter 12, however, we're going to take a look at the total demand and total supply for the entire economy. The structure of this chapter is very, very similar to chapter 3. In chapter 3, we define demand, then we look at the shape of demand curve. We did the same thing for supply, then we put the demand and supply together to define our market equilibrium. We're going to do exactly the same thing in chapter 12. We're going to define our aggregate demand, define our aggregate supply. We will look at the shape of aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We're going to put them together to define our macroeconomic equilibrium or full employment. So we have different terminologies in this chapter, so I want you to kind of pay attention to them. So let me also open my my lecture notes. Remember that I definitely recommend you guys to, you know that I have these kind of videos where I talk over the notes. I know they are long, and some of you guys might not have time, or you're not that patient to watch it, but I definitely recommend you guys to at least watch it for this chapter. And I'm going to kind of highlight important things that you need to know in this video. I'm not going to talk about detail because I explained them already in that video. So I want you definitely to watch that video. And remember, you can have the formulas, even graphs, when you are taking the final exam, but just make sure that you also understand them and know how to use them, especially the formulas or the graphs, okay? So we're going to define aggregate demand, but to understand aggregate demand, just like chapter 3, we need to understand the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. Since we're talking about the entire economy, we kind of label the quantity demanded differently. We call it the quantity of real GDP demanded. Same thing also for supply. So again, make sure you know the difference between these two. Aggregate demand is basically the list of the different prices, different the quantity of real GDP demanded, but the quantity of real GDP demanded is just one single number. If the price is 10, your quantity demanded is 5. So that's just one single number. But the aggregate demand is different prices and different quantity demanded, just like chapter 3. And you will see that the components of this quantity of real GDP demanded are what we had for GDP, consumer expenditures, C, investment, government spending, net export, okay? So it is kind of related also to chapter 7, right? So we define aggregate demand, and then we're going to take a look at the aggregate demand, the shape of aggregate demand, the aggregate demand curve. And you will see that, again, we have that inverse relationship that we had for price and quantity demanded in chapter 3. And then you will see that we will, again, have a downward slope aggregate demand. So typical shape for demand, aggregate demand is also downward slope, just like demand we had in chapter 3. There's no difference. Something that I should also mention is about price. Since we're talking about the entire economy here, we're talking about the price level, something we also had in chapter 9. That is the price, the average price of all the goods and services that we consume. So aggregate demand shows the relationship between this price level and the quantity demanded, the real GDP, the quantity of real GDP demanded. And we're going to do the same thing for for aggregate supply. But if you also remember, before we move on to the supply side of the economy, we talked about the determinants of demand in chapter 3. We had income, we have price of related goods, we had expectations. All those were determinants of demand. We have also our determinants of kind of demand here. These are the factors that can shift our aggregate demand. Okay, we have consumer spending, C, we have I, investment, we have government expenditures, and we have net export. So not only we have the GDP components inside basically our quantity of real GDP demanded, but there are also the factors that can shift our aggregate demand. So kind of easy to remember, right? So C, I, G, and net export are also the factors that can shift our aggregate demand. Again, if for instance investment increases, your aggregate demand will shift to the right because your aggregate demand is increasing. If consumption expenditure is going down, your other factors remain the same, your aggregate demand will shift to the left because your aggregate demand is decreasing, just like chapter 3. We're going to do the same thing for aggregate supply. So aggregate supply shows the relationship between the different prices, price level, and quantity of real GDP supply. We called it quantity supplied in chapter 3 here. So since we're talking about the entire economy, we call that quantity supply, quantity of real GDP supplied. Okay, and you will see that the quantity supplied here depends on how much labor we hire, workers we hire, how much capital we are spending, how much technology we are using. It depends on our natural resources, our land, all those things, okay? And then we again have the similar kind of result for our aggregate demand in terms of the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP supply. We had this positive relationship between price and quantity supplied in chapter 3. That's why we had an upward slope supply. We have a similar shape here because again we have that positive relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP supply. So our aggregate supply is also upward slope. We are going next to we're going to talk about the factors that can shift our aggregate supply. We're focused on the price of input, specifically oil in this chapter, and also productivity that we also defined it in a previous chapter. Or chapters, I should say. These are the factors that can shift our aggregate supply. We're just focused on the short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. That's where we have the downward slope aggregate demand and upward slope aggregate supply. Then we're going to put them together to define our macroeconomic equilibrium, which is also called full employment. So pay attention to the graph. Is very again similar. But that was the intersection of our aggregate demand and aggregate supply, just like chapter 3. Then we're going to talk about, just like chapter 3, shifting aggregate demand and aggregate supply at the equilibrium. If you remember in chapter 3, we kept the supply fixed, then we shifted demand at the equilibrium to the right or to the left. Then we found our new equilibrium, new price, new quantity. Then we kept the demand fixed, and we started playing with supply. We shift the supply to the right, to the left. We found our new equilibrium, equilibrium price, new equilibrium quantity. And then we had complex cases where we changed the demand and supply at the same time. We are not going to talk about complex cases in this chapter, but we will talk about shifting our aggregate demand where aggregate supply is fixed. And then we're going to shift our aggregate supply or change our aggregate supply where our aggregate demand is fixed. Okay, we're not going to talk about complex cases here. When we talk about shifting our aggregate demand when aggregate supply is fixed, I want you to pay attention to two important concepts: recessionary gap and inflationary gap. because we are going to come back to these two topics, recessionary and inflationary, in chapter 13 and chapter 16, when we talk about government actions of government to fix the market through fiscal policy. And in chapter 16, we will talk about the Federal Reserve's actions when we have recession or inflation using monetary policy. Okay, so we will come back to these two topics. So recessionary gap is basically, in short, is when there is a gap between the actual amount of output or the real GDP that the market is producing and the potential GDP, which is the amount of GDP. Sorry, I got a text. The real GDP that the economy is able to produce when we are at full employment. Okay, so potential GDP is just one single number. Okay, remember that. So that is the gap, and we have this recessionary gap because the aggregate demand is just low, or we have kind of like a leftward shift in aggregate demand. Okay, inflationary gap is different. It's kind of the opposite. Inflationary gap happens when I'm trying to move on with the sorry. So inflationary gap, however, happens when your aggregate demand is just too high, and that causes the prices actually to increase. When we have recessionary gap, the economy is slow, and you have the gap between your real GDP and your potential GDP because the level of output is just too low. The aggregate demand is just too low. That's why we call it recessionary gap, because the level of output is just too low. When we have inflationary gap, however, it's because the prices are just too high. We have obviously inflation because we are producing too much output. So your aggregate demand is just too high, okay? And there is, again, this gap between your real GDP and your potential GDP. This time, the market is just producing too much. Your real GDP is way more than your potential GDP. In future chapters, we'll learn, as I mentioned, how we can fix the recessionary gap and inflationary gap and move back to full employment or macroeconomic equilibrium, okay? So I want you to pay attention to these two. And then we will talk about shifting our aggregate supply. So I want you to pay attention to when aggregate demand is fixed. So I want you to pay attention to graphs where we're shifting the aggregate supply to the right or to the left because of the changes in the price of oil or change in productivity. There are another one important definition. This is called stagflation. I want you to pay attention to that. And that's pretty much it for this chapter. Again, I put some information about the long run aggregate supply. We're not interested in long run. It's just for your information. We're focused on short run. So you have skipped that part if you don't want to study. But the important part of this chapter is to understand aggregate demand, knowing the shape of aggregate demand, the factors that can change or shift our aggregate demand. Same thing for aggregate supply, and how we're defining the macroeconomic equilibrium or full employment, and also the changes that will happen at the equilibrium, because constantly things are changing in the economy in real world. So our aggregate demand and aggregate supply are constantly shifting and moving. So I want you to pay attention to graphs and make sure you have some practice in terms of drawing graphs, just like we had in chapter 3. There's a homework for this chapter I want you to complete. Let me know if you have any question. Again, I highly recommend you guys to review chapter 3 just to make sure that you know the general concept of demand and supply. If you still struggle, please let me know. That's it. I cannot think about anything else. Take a look at also the separate videos that I made, for instance, for inflationary gap, recessionary gap on D12. All right. Till next time.